Hello, I'm longtime journalist and blogger Mark Anderson. I cover Congress, among other things, periodically. In the wake of the Charlottesville melee, let me be blunt right up front. Internationalism is the real problem, not nationalism, whatever shortcomings that nationalism in its many variations may contain. Nationalism can be good or bad, but is nationhood bad? But let's consider internationalism, the kind that consists of the forced integration of nations along economic, political, cultural, and other lines. It's really bad news, ladies and gentlemen. Internationalism is the primary force behind the permanent war that's ravaging the world. Internationalist wars of terror, conducted by NATO and the governments of the US, UK, etc., while deceptively described as the war on terror, have long killed and maimed hundreds of thousands of men, women, and children, mostly people of color, take note. How ironic. And we assume that violence against and the presumed hatred of people of color was the exclusive and is the exclusive domain of nationalists, white nationalists no less. But is that really the case across the board? Isn't internationalism the real enduring scourge, the endless lie, the false hope, the propaganda line? It's important here to be crystal clear. We're not talking about international relations in terms of goodwill among peoples and nations. That's a good thing. We need lots more of it every day. Rather, what we're discussing here is forced, I repeat, forced internationalism used as a tool of world consolidation in which the will of all people of all colors and their freedoms is extinguished. You see, the monotonous left versus right thing pumped by the big media during and after the recent events in Charlottesville, Virginia, is simply an orchestrated psychological process to create chaos, tension, and violence between everyday people. Meanwhile, the plutocratic bigwigs, the super rich who own both political parties and own the major press, look down upon people of all colors, looking down on us like Zeus from Mount Olympus, prodding the population like cattle into the next stampede, anything to take the focus off the top of their pyramid of power. Yet, the June 2016 Brexit vote, calling for Britain to leave the EU, and the election of Donald Trump as U.S. president, like him or not, heightened the fears of the highbrow big bankers, top corporate captains, leading media moguls and editors, and others among the plutocracy who were already feeling their influence slipping away due to alternative media and citizens getting their own facts with growing audiences. Since those on the side of falsehood only have so many tricks to try, they planned or exploited the Charlottesville situation. Through their media control and through agents like billionaire George Soros and his financing of the leftist violent Antifa group and other groups, they cooked up a narrative that makes it sound like the far right is solely to blame for the Virginia violence. As if the far right is solely to blame. Indeed, as the media portray it, the largely innocent left staged an angry but socially acceptable counter-protest, which is somehow justified in its violence, involving, as it did, Antifa hoods throwing containers of cement, urine, feces, and other pleasantries in Charlottesville. But the right wing's mere presence in Charlottesville is being defined as pure violence in and of itself, as well as their beliefs. We're told over and over again that the nationalist right is the only menace, and that no one among the right could possibly have a worthwhile point of view or opinion, which is why their opinions are rarely, if ever, reported. We only get smears and character assassinations from the worthless mainstream media. Now listen closely here. A highly dependable source on the ground explained to me that at Lee Park in Charlottesville, where the group Unite the Right legally obtained a permit to state its views against removing Confederate statuary in mid-August 2017, there were several early scattered skirmishes all over the place, making it impossible to determine for sure who threw the first punch, so to speak. The first thing my source, an unbiased Capitol Hill credentialed journalist, saw was an apparent Antifa protester trying to pepper spray Richard Spencer, a United Right figure who was one of the chief speakers at the rally there in Charlottesville. My source also heard that at other locations around the park, before noon as Unite the Righters were showing up for their rally, some from the right, perhaps threw the first punch. It was a mixed bag. So to say that left-wingers were there only as counter-protesters, simply responding to the Unite the Right group, just cannot be stated as hard fact. Yet that's what the big media tells us. And of course, the New York Times did a recent profile of Antifa, saying they're taking a swing at the right, again portraying Antifa as a somewhat violent but largely misunderstood, quasi-forgivable group that can pretty much do whatever it wants as long as it's portrayed as civil disobedience against the right. Moreover, it's been established that while leftist groups were granted their own permits to express their views in nearby areas of town, although some of that's a little fuzzy, it was Unite the Right that had gotten a Lee Park permit to hold their rally. And my source also confirmed that once the skirmishes began in Lee Park, the police prevented some people from leaving the area to the north, or that direction in general, thereby shrinking the battlefield of conflict and pushing the leftists and rightists closer together, which set the stage for intensified violence. From there, with the police evidently failing to protect the Unite the Righters and their right to protest under their permitted event, the violence from both sides intensified and spilled into town in greater areas, larger areas. So that, to the best of my understanding at this point on August 21st, 2017, led to a situation where people were clustered together in the streets as street combat ensued. And because the police, who were told to stand down by the city's mayor, did not form a barrier to stop the street fighting and disperse the crowd regardless of who was responsible, the protesters therefore remained close to each other in these dense groupings, providing an easy target for the driver who reportedly plowed into the crowd and killed a 32-year-old woman. No one is excusing his actions, as ambiguous as the news is about exactly what happened. Simply what I'm saying is that conditions were created that made it easier for this to happen, that intensify the likelihood of ever escalating violence rather than dispersing it. This doesn't mean, of course, that the police were directly responsible for the girl's death. Of course not. But not quelling the violence due to this stand-down order carried with it some bitter and very specific consequences. And while the left-wingers in the Antifa group are known, some of them anyway, to be financed by Marxist-minded billionaire and revolutionary globalist godfather George Soros, some of the right-wing agitators may have been paid provocateurs sent in to intentionally look for trouble. Some of that's still being investigated. You could have paid-for provocateurs from either side to create this melee to take the minds of the American people off larger issues. That's evidently what's really at work here ultimately. And true, some of this is speculation at this point, August 21, but it fits the general mold of terrorism and what terrorism's real classical purpose is, and that's to spark political change. We Americans have got to put our heads together, whether we're from the left or the right, and understand that the violence of terrorism is just a means to an end. The end is political upheaval. That's how classical terrorism works. So the Virginia violence likely was just the powder keg event that carried with it the necessary terroristic actions. But the action is in the reaction. And as the smoke clears amid louder, misguided calls for President Trump's impeachment, we need to understand this bigger picture. It's very important. And here's what the media, which is part of the world power establishment and not its watchdog, is really after, in my opinion: the abolition of nationalism itself, or the idea of the nation state, of nationhood, the abolition of these things, and the thoughts that encourage them. It seems that the powers that be have had enough, in other words. We are going to be internationalists who support the permanent world war on terror, whether we like it or not. The left and the right could and should, keep this in mind, unite together and oppose this endless war machine. That's why it's so imperative that we are divided by the powers that be, to put an end to our anti-war sentiments and to disallow this unity, just like was done in the late 60s and early 70s when the Vietnam War still raged and the establishment moved against the anti-war protest movement and infiltrated it and let it off the cliff. And the U.S. government in the current era has been at war since 2001 nonstop, making the war on terror the longest ever modern military crusade, possibly in all of history, but certainly in the more modern era, say the last couple hundred years. Winning such an undeclared war isn't even possible to define, much less to achieve. It cannot be won. So additional significant uprisings evidently will not be tolerated by the internationalist terrorists in the governments and corporations who demonize nationalism and nationhood of whatever stripe as a means of deception. Accordingly, governments cannot give any quarter to someone who might have visions of national sovereignty and peace among nations. And perhaps that's why Trump advisor Steve Bannon, like him or not, was fired or resigned within 1 week of the Virginia violence, approximately. He's on record as having been a voice within the White House against unending military conflict. And that's advertised in this recent front page Wall Street Journal piece about it, which is rather telling. And what it says in this subheadline right here is Bannon, the chief strategist, had pushed the president toward a nationalist populist agenda, as if that is something so unseemly it can barely be mentioned. But here ultimately is what it's all about, ladies and gentlemen, as I've analyzed this issue. And I'm looking at the Muskegon, Michigan Chronicle here as I wind up this. But here's the basic guilt by association syllogism that's being put out here. The media is using this as white equals nationalist equals supremacist equals KKK equals neo-Nazi equals hateful, violent, criminally inclined people equals terrorist equals enemy of the state and the people. In other words, to deplore and denounce nationalism, nationhood, and anything, lump it all in the far-right category, even though that's not accurate, while ignoring the sins of the left, and portray those that are pro-nationhood as essentially criminal in nature or would-be criminal who carry out violence like reportedly driving cars into people. This is the unfair criminalizing effect that's going on by the real haters among the powers that be who are labeling their enemies as haters, even though both sides, the left and the right, have their provocateurs and have their faults and their sins, warts and all. Nobody is excusing the extremists on either side. But we should not criminalize speech and thought and ideas in the process. And yet the media does things like this. They put out cartoons like this one by Mike Lukovich, a noted political cartoonist, that show Putin bombing Capitol Hill. And Trump cavalierly is in front of that as the Capitol Hill explodes and says, "Thank you, Putin, for reducing the size of government." And that, of course, is libel because President Trump, like him or not, whatever his faults might be, has reached out to Russian leader Vladimir Putin seeking peace, not encouraging war, and trying to get together to bring the Syrian situation under control. So this is pure misinformation, pure libel, talking about the fact that the media believes that Trump is leading us into the nuclear destruction of D.C. when nothing could be further than the truth. Is that not inciting hatred? Is that not inciting images of total and absolute violence by the mainstream media? At any rate, it's becoming clearer than ever that nationalism and views of nationhood in general are being libeled, demonized, and banished, potentially, because the internationalists, who are the real terrorists, are scared to death by the Brexit vote and Trump's election, and they feel they've got to tighten their dominance before alternative media and informed citizens get any stronger. So you see, there's only really one dividing line. It's not left versus right. It's not black versus white. Here's what it is. It's the plutocracy versus all people. And if we wise up and see what their long-term big picture tactics are, we can pull out of this morass and have a much better united society where we all get together and make life better and our nation better and the world better for all of us. Thanks for listening. I'm Mark Anderson. We'll see you next time on this and other outlets.